In today's lecture on video, we're going to be covering Chapter 1, What Makes People Unhappy. This chapter is the first in the section called Causes of Unhappiness, and really it underscores and elaborates one part of what I call his recipe for happiness, which I talked about in the introduction video, Introduction 1. Discover the things you most desire to achieve happiness, pursue them full out, and then let go of things that are unrealistic, and also diminish preoccupation with yourself. This chapter is all about why preoccupation with yourself leads to unhappiness and ways to diminish preoccupation with yourself. So he calls this various things, and we might call it various things by light of contemporary understandings of such. Preoccupation with yourself he calls narrow self-focus. He also calls this self-absorption. We might call this today narcissism in all of its varieties. He came to this conclusion, like I mentioned before, by analyzing his own life. He had an auspicious turn or conversion from a self-loathing, suicidal adolescence to a productive adulthood in which he discloses that he enjoyed progressively more and more deeply across his long life. Interestingly enough, Jonathan Haidt, who wrote the happiness hypothesis, has a similar conversionary experience in his youth. Bertrand Russell says, "Gradually I learned to be indifferent to myself and my deficiencies. I came to center my attention upon external objects, the state of the world, various branches of knowledge, individuals with whom I felt affection," which he generally calls all of those things, compared to preoccupation with oneself, as impersonal or objective interests. So I might refer to that later on. One of the sources of unhappiness, fatigue, and nervous strain is the inability to be interested in anything that is not of practical importance in one's own life, or living primarily by egoistic motives. This causes a lot of strain and unnecessary suffering to be so caught up, so worried about one's own possibilities in life, one's success in life, one's security, one's own needs, we might say. Too much focus on maintaining, enhancing one's personal life, position in life, possibilities in life, actually backfires in ways we'll review later on. Jonathan Haidt says, instead of following tried and true Buddhist and Stoic advice to surrender attachments and let events happen, we surround ourselves with goals, hopes, and expectations, and then feel pleasure and pain in relation to our progress. This is a beautiful description of the egoic orientation to life that by default many of us are operating as. Alan Watts says, when the ego project is abandoned, an altogether new and more powerful freedom is known, the freedom of union or harmony between man and life. If we are still trapped by ego and egoic motives, largely and for the most part, we probably fall into one of these three categories of narrow self-focus. He has his own terminology for these three types. I'm going to update them in light of contemporary terminology. The first type of narrow self-focus that one can become involved in is a type of narrow self-focus that is really centered on being self-conscious and shame-riddled. This is a psychology dominated by shame, guilt, judgment, self-punitiveness or self-punishment, self-loathing, perfectionism, insecurity, which is often associated with or acquired through criticalness, competitiveness, and conditional love in childhood. The second form of narrow self-focus seems like the converse, which is being egotistical, as we commonly say, or being full of ourselves. A psychology dominated by admiration, vanity, and needs for self-assurance. The third type of narrow self-focus is becoming power hungry. This is a psychology dominated by the need for control. the need to win, often acquired through humiliation in childhood or powerlessness. In all of these types, in the more shame-riddled psychology, in the vain psychology, and the need for control and power kind of psychology, he speculates that a normal development was thwarted in childhood. This is Bertrand Russell's speculation. That gives somebody a one-sided obsession with his or her childhood deprivation, and that an emphasis upon achievement, outcome, or image over vital interest and investment in activities leads to unhappiness. Impersonal or objective interests lets us invest in something outside of ourselves, in something substantial. He says all serious success in work depends upon genuine interest in the material with which the work is concerned. He has some great examples in chapter 1 of people who are motivated by egoistic motives versus people who are actually interested in what they're doing, in the work they're doing, in the art they're making, in the project in their community they're working on, and how that motive gets infused in the quality of whatever you are involved in. There are some other sources, of course, of unhappiness. He goes into a little thing on repression, not living true to oneself. He says on page 113, no person should be expected to distort the main lives of his life for the sake of another individual. So he's saying that codependency, which is a huge problem, it's very common, leads to unhappiness. But his main premise, what we should just pull forward from chapter 1, is that narrow self-focus is a primary culprit of unhappiness. You should look to ways in which maybe your whole life is dominated by narrow self-focus, or maybe parts of it are, and ways that you can really invest yourself in, again, objective or impersonal interest in things outside of yourself, and trusting that you'll be taken care of. I think there's the rub. A lot of our narrow self-focus is driven by fear. He doesn't really analyze this. This is more of a clinical perspective. Fear that we're not going to get our needs met. And so we try to control around that. So I think the replacement is trust that your needs are going to get met plus more if you invest in other people, invest in projects outside of yourself, invest in substantial realities rather than obsessing about yourself. Lastly, even though this is a simple premise, a simple conclusion, Alan Watts does remind us that teachings like this are easy sells to the head, he says, that derive from careful philosophy. We might understand how we suffer, how we create unhappiness, how we misery make for ourselves. But it's so difficult to convince the heart to base one's attitude of life on a universal as distinct from a purely personal point of view.